We all make mistakes. Yes, I said it. We all make mistakes. It's something we all do. It's something we all regret at the time, but it's something we all learn from. You had that spicy taco last night. Well, you're going to learn from the mistake that you made because you're in for a rough day today, my friend. If you drank too much alcohol last night, same thing. You're going to regret it. You're probably not going to learn from it. You're probably going to pretend that you learned from it for about 2 days, and then you're going to go right back to it because you didn't learn from your mistake. The point is, people, we have to learn from our mistakes, and some people do, some people don't. And we're going to be going through a list of the 20th century prime ministers of the United Kingdom and their single biggest mistake. Now, I know that this is subjective perhaps, but not necessarily, because this is a mistake widely regarded as being a mistake by either the politicians of the time, the people of the time, historians today, and so forth. So without further ado, here are, in order, the 20th century UK prime ministers and their single biggest mistake. Quick disclaimer here, folks. We are leaving it to the 20th century prime ministers simply because, quite simply, it's going to lead into a political debate and political argument if I include some of the more modern contemporary prime ministers. And there have been many in recent years, that's for sure. And whereas I am always up for a political debate with you, this is not the place to do it. So we're going to be limiting it to, we'll include Gordon Brown too, because he's kind of a 20th century prime minister, even though he technically isn't. Though Robert Gascoigne Cecil was technically the first prime minister of the 20th century, given that his premiership ended in 1902, we're going to only include prime ministers who were elected in the 20th century. So we're going to start with our good friend Arthur Balfour, who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom between 1902 and 1905. Arthur Balfour's single biggest political mistake is often viewed as being the Balfour Declaration of November 2nd, 1917, and this declaration expressed British support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. And as you know, Israel and Palestine is consistently and constantly in the news lately, and the Balfour Declaration played a major part in the tensions there. So there was the promises to two different groups. One major criticism of the Balfour Declaration is the promise of the same land to both the Jewish and Arab populations in Palestine. And this dual commitment set the stage for tensions and conflicts between the two communities, which are still warring today. Critics also argued that the declaration, by expressing support for a national home for the Jewish people, did not adequately consider the rights and aspirations of the indigenous Arab population in Palestine, and this disregard for the Arab perspective contributed to long-standing conflicts in the region. And the long-term impact of the Balfour Declaration is obviously evident in the ongoing Israeli-Palestine conflict. The issues surrounding borders, refugees, and the status of Jerusalem are rooted in part in the historical events and decisions that followed the declaration. So I guess this would be Balfour's worst mistake. I mean, I'm sure there were good intentions, maybe, but it's hard to agree with that. Anyway, up next, we have Henry Campbell Bannerman, and a prime minister that history often forgets, but one who is potentially one of the better ones. He was a radical. He was prime minister between 1905 till 1908 when he resigned due to poor health. He died just 19 days later, and he's the only prime minister to die in the official residence, 10 Downing Street, as well as the last liberal prime minister of the United Kingdom. So what is his worst mistake? Well, I had to do some research for this one because I don't know an awful lot about him, but the more I read about him, the more I like. And it appears as though his biggest mistake was military reform. After failures in the Boer War and the rise of Imperial Germany as a major force within Europe, whose economy had surpassed even the British, there was a big demand for reform of the British Army and the British military, and the Escher Report was released, and this made a few recommendations of change, which eventually resulted in cuts to defense spending. And this would be of great detriment to Britain and the United Kingdom during the First World War, which was only a few years later, less than a decade later, and it exposed many of the weakened capabilities of the British Empire to maintain its empire. And I guess this would probably be his biggest mistake, as this occurred during his premiership. It's not even entirely his fault. It was approved by the King, Edward VII, and recommended to him. So I would put this down as his biggest mistake. If anyone has any bigger suggestions, please leave a message in the comments so that I can read into it. Next, we have H.H. Asquith. Asquith was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom between 1908 and 1916, and though he was originally a very popular Prime Minister, his tenure is marked by many mistakes. In fact, his is so far the most difficult premiership to sum up with one mistake, because there are so many, from the failure to address the issue of women's suffrage during his premiership, to the lack of a coalition government. He failed to unite Britain's politics during World War One, like in World War Two, where we had a coalition government. There was no such coalition government in World War One because of him. But I'm probably going to put his worst mistake as his handling of World War One. His management of World War One has been subject to much criticism, and some historians argue that he was slow to respond to the demands of war, and his administration faced challenges in terms of military strategy, munitions, production, and the overall coordination of war efforts. Britain's military capabilities had been downgraded to the point where they were not adequately prepared for the scale and intensity of what was a modern war. The British military faced shortages in essential equipment, and this unpreparedness contributed to difficulties on the Western Front, certainly within the early years of the war. And the management of the military strategy and coordination faced challenges under his leadership. There were issues with the overall planning and execution of military campaigns, including the Dardanelles Campaign, or Gallipoli, in 1915, which ended in failure and heavy casualties. So this would probably be his biggest mistake. His handling of World War One is often criticized most by historians, and rightfully so, because it's the one which led to the most deaths, and it led to his resignation, which again was terrible considering he was leaving during the middle of World War One. And yeah, he's just a failure, ladies and gentlemen. David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom between 1916 and 1922. He was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during some of its most turbulent times during the First World War, and he has some notable achievements, notably his First World War leadership, the People's Budget of 1909, the National Insurance Act of 1911, land reforms, Representation of the People Act of 1918, the Versailles Treaty negotiations. But in some ways, David Lloyd George has become an infamous figure in British history and is considered by some as being something of a traitor, mostly because he became a friend and perhaps ally of Adolf Hitler. Yes, the first few prime ministers on this list are going to have their worst mistake as being something to do with Hitler. It's just inevitable. In 1936, David Lloyd George wrote an article titled "I Talk to Hitler" in the Daily Express newspaper, and it says some rather questionable things. This is a reading from Lloyd George himself, of course. This is not me impersonating him. "I have now seen the famous German leader and also something of the great change he has effected. Whatever one may think of his methods, and they are certainly not those of a parliamentary country, there can be no doubt that he has achieved a marvellous transformation in the spirit of the people, in their attitude towards each other, and in their social and economic outlook. There is for the first time since the war a general sense of security. The people are more cheerful. There is a greater sense of general gaiety of spirits throughout the land. It is a happier Germany. I saw it everywhere, and Englishmen I met during my trip and who knew Germany well were very impressed with the change. As to his popularity, especially among the youth of Germany, there can be no manner of doubt. The old trust him, the young idolize him. It is not the admiration according to you get the point, people, okay? So he developed this rather weird affection with Adolf Hitler, and as people will know, there is Operation Sea Lion, which was Germany's attempt to conquer the island of Great Britain, and their plan was to install David Lloyd George as a puppet prime minister should they ever succeed with Operation Sea Lion. So in some ways, it's clear that David Lloyd George became not only a friend of Adolf Hitler, but an ally too, and this would probably be his biggest mistake. Yes, it didn't occur while he was prime minister, but it's something which will overshadow many of his achievements. Next, we have Stanley Baldwin, a man who was Prime Minister on 3 different occasions, from 1923 to 1924, 1924 to 1929, and 1935 to 1937. And though he is sometimes generally well regarded, there were some notable mistakes, and I deliberated over which one was probably his worst, from the Channel Crisis in 1922 to the beginning of the appeasement of Nazi Germany and Hitler, which didn't necessarily start with Neville Chamberlain. It did start with Stanley Baldwin in some ways. But I think I've narrowed it down to the worst being his general disregard of Spain during its war against Francisco Franco during the Spanish Civil War. Stanley Baldwin was more fearful of communism spreading throughout Europe, and for this reason he was less convinced by the socialists fighting within Spain and more favorable towards Francisco Franco, who was of course receiving support from the likes of Benito Mussolini in Italy and Adolf Hitler in Germany. And Stanley Baldwin's main concern was the rise of communism, and Stalin, who was on the side of the Spanish socialists to some extent, though not greatly as much as they would have liked. And Baldwin's reluctance to do anything about this is part of why Spain fell to the fascists, where it would remain for 30 plus years. So, yes, I'm going to put Stanley Baldwin's worst crime as being his neglect of Spain during the Spanish Civil War. Next, we have Ramsay MacDonald, who was the first ever Labour Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and he was Prime Minister firstly between January 1924 and November 1924, and then again for a second time between 1929 and 1935. And there are many political mistakes that he made, and arguably his biggest political mistake was not one that was really a reflection of his government, but one which was seen as a traitorous move on his own personal account. He went into government with the Conservative Party and formed National Labour. This was seen as the ultimate betrayal by socialist workers at the time, as the Labour Party was founded in part by MacDonald, and it was founded to represent the labours of Britain. And of course, the Conservative Party was seen as the opposite of this, as it kind of still is today. And as a result, MacDonald is still seen as a traitor today and is sometimes largely forgotten by history. So this would probably be his biggest political mistake. Otherwise, his handling of the Depression was just as bad, if not worse. Next, we come to Neville Chamberlain, who was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom between 1937 and 1940. Poor Neville. We know what his greatest mistake is. It's well documented. If you went to school in the United Kingdom, you will know that his greatest mistake was the general appeasement of Nazi Germany, which was also called the policy of appeasement. So, the policy of appeasement emerged in the context of the harsh terms imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles, another mistake by David Lloyd George, by the way, after World War I. Many British leaders, including Chamberlain, believed that addressing Germany's grievances and avoiding another war were crucial for European stability, and Germany under Adolf Hitler sought to overturn what it perceived as unjust provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, including territorial losses and military restrictions. So Chamberlain, along with other Western leaders, was sympathetic to much of these grievances, and despite Chamberlain's efforts, appeasement ultimately failed to prevent war. Hitler's ambitions extended beyond the concessions granted in Munich, and in 1939 Germany invaded Poland, leading to the outbreak of World War II. The failure of appeasement is often criticized for emboldening Hitler and allowing the German military machine to grow stronger, while Chamberlain had to resign basically from the sheer shame of allowing this to happen, and history remembers him as being someone rather cowardly who allowed Nazi Germany to progress to the point where it was close to conquering much of Europe and the wider world. Chamberlain's believing that Hitler should not be confronted militarily but rather negotiated with, it didn't go well, and Hitler took advantage of it. Winston Churchill. As said, Winston Churchill is one of the most famous and well-known and quoted prime ministers in the history of the United Kingdom. He is remembered most fondly for his leadership during the Second World War, which of course resulted in a British victory alongside the rest of the Allies. However, he has notable mistakes throughout his career, most notably his, and this is before he was prime minister, his role in the Gallipoli crisis, which resulted in thousands of deaths during the First World War. As Secretary of State for War and Air in 1919, Churchill was known most notably for his deploying the controversial Black and Tans to fight the Irish Republican Army in Ireland. Speaking as a Welsh person, he's also remembered for his act to send in the army against striking workers in South Wales during 1910. So there are many mistakes he made, and of course this is subjective. They might not be mistakes to everyone, but to most people they would be. But his biggest mistake is arguably his handling of the Bengal famine in 1943, which led to the deaths of over 3 million people, and Churchill's actions or lack of action have been the subject of widespread criticism for almost a century, whereas his role in the Bengal famine of 1943 is often a topic of historical debate. It's kind of clear, and critics would argue that Churchill's policies exacerbated the famine. He redirected resources, including food supplies, for the war effort, and there are claims that he resisted diverting ships to transport rice to Bengal. And some argue that his prioritization of military needs over humanitarian concerns contributed to the severity of the famine, and it's well known that Churchill was better as a wartime leader, and this is why he was in charge of the war efforts, while Clement Attlee, more on him later, was more in charge of running the country in the United Kingdom. So Churchill's defenders will say that the Bengal famine was a complex crisis with multiple causes, and on our last video, which was the crimes of the British Empire, which included the Bengal famine, we did have a couple of comments suggesting suggest this, and that's fair to point out. They point out that the wartime conditions and disruptions, as well as factors beyond Churchill's control, played significant roles in the famine. But it's important to note that the responsibility for the Bengal famine is a complex historical issue, and it's probably the fault of Winston Churchill in more ways than none. But Churchill was the leader during this time, and given his other controversies of the time, which most notably included a number of disrespectful comments about Mahatma Gandhi, who Churchill once said, "It is alarming and nauseating to see Mr. Gandhi, a seditious Middle Temple lawyer, now posing as a fakir, striding half naked up the steps of the Vice-Regal Palace." And Churchill even referred to him as a bad man and an enemy of the empire. So there was a disregard for India by Churchill during this time, and given he was the leader, he has to be responsible for much of the Bengal famine. So that's going to be his worst mistake here. Next, we have Clement Attlee. Clement Attlee, like Churchill, is remembered as one of the greatest prime ministers in the United Kingdom's history. However, unlike Churchill, he was known as less of a charismatic figure, and he was known more for his substance. He was the substance to Churchill's style, in essence, which is probably why they did so well together during the Second World War. However, though Attlee has some incredible achievements, most notably the birth of the National Health Service, the NHS, his biggest mistake is one which still has profound effects on the world today, particularly within South Asia, because we're returning to India for this one, folks, okay? So Clement Attlee was largely responsible for the poor mishandling of the partition of India and Pakistan. So one point of criticism often raised of Attlee during this time is the withdrawal of British troops from India in 1947, which led to the partition of the country into India and Pakistan. The manner in which the withdrawal and partition were handled was accompanied by widespread communal violence and mass migrations, which resulted in significant loss of life and displacement. So while the decision to grant independence to India was inevitable and had widespread support, and Attlee was very early support for this, in fact, some critics argue that the speed of the withdrawal and the lack of effective plans to manage the partition process contributed to the violence and suffering. Britain was poorer due to the Second World War, and it had less military resources and therefore withdrew entirely. And Attlee's government has faced retrospective criticism for not doing enough to prevent or mitigate the consequences of the partition, which was a brutal and bloody affair. So it's important to note that though Attlee was a very early supporter of Indian independence, the actual process of it, when it occurred and finally fell into place, was not very well executed, and it led to the deaths and misplacement of millions of people, and has caused much of the troubles between India and Pakistan, which still exist today. So Attlee, buddy, that one's on you. Next, we have Anthony Eden, and if you don't know who that is, that's probably because he was only Prime Minister between 1955 and 1957, and though he was only Prime Minister for a short amount of time, he has one of the most noteworthy mistakes on this list, because it's the Suez Crisis of 1956, and this was a major international incident that unfolded when Eden, along with France and Israel, took military action against Egypt in response to the nationalization of the Suez Canal by Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser. And the Suez Crisis is widely regarded as a significant mistake in British foreign policy. Eden's decision to use military force without consulting the United States or the Soviet Union, and without proper authorization from the United Nations, ultimately led to diplomatic and military failure. The US and Soviet Union, concerned about the potential for the conflict to escalate and disrupt Cold War dynamics, pressured the UK, France and Israel into a humiliating withdrawal and ended the UK's worldwide reputation as a global superpower. And the Suez Crisis damaged Britain's standing on the world stage and had long-lasting consequences for the country's influence in international affairs as a result. Eden's handling of the crisis was criticised not only for its lack of success, but also for the secrecy and deception involved in the planning and execution of the military intervention. It's often considered Anthony Eden's most significant mistake during his time as Prime Minister, and it's why he was Prime Minister for so little time. It essentially destroyed his political career, and it's why he's not really very well regarded by historians today. He wasn't Prime Minister long enough to do much else, so this is one of the few UK Prime Ministers where a mistake defined their entire career. Anyway, next we have Harold Macmillan, who was the Conservative Prime Minister between 1957 and 1963. So Harold Macmillan was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during some turbulent times. I mean, it's still the post-war era, even though it's been a little while now since the Second World War, but Britain is going through a period of decolonization. It's weaker on the global stage, partly because of Anthony Eden, and it's in a period of decline, essentially. And Harold Macmillan is tasked with trying to reverse justice, and instead he is remembered in some ways, and in most ways, for one mistake, which wasn't actually him. So the Profumo affair in 1963. So the Profumo affair involved John Profumo, who was the Secretary of State for War in Macmillan's government, and his involvement with Christine Keeler, a model who was romantically linked to a Soviet naval attaché. Profumo initially denied any impropriety in the House of Commons, but as details of the affair emerged, it became clear that he had misled Parliament. The scandal damaged the credibility of the government and contributed to a sense of crisis. Macmillan's handling of the affair and his subsequent reshuffling in the cabinet was seen by some as insufficient to address the public's concerns about integrity and transparency within the government. And while the Profumo affair was not the only challenge faced by Macmillan during his time as PM, it is often cited as a significant event that eroded public trust and contributed to the perception of a government in decline. Macmillan resigned in 1963 and then was followed by his good friend Alec Douglas Home, who led the Conservative Party into the general election later that year. So the Profumo affair is considered by many as being one of the factors which most contributed to the decline of Macmillan's premiership and his ultimate resignation, so it has to be his worst mistake. As we mentioned, next we have Alec Douglas Home, who was only Prime Minister for 365 days, and there's not a whole lot of things to judge here. I mean, Rhodesia gained independence during this time, but it wasn't him who instigated the negotiations for that, so it's not really his fault. I mean, we could say the general election loss of 1964 would be his biggest mistake, maybe? I mean, yeah, we're gonna go with that. I can't think of anything else. If you think of something, please let us know in the comment section below. Maybe we're missing something glaringly obvious. Anyway, next we have Harold Wilson, who holds the rare distinction of being Prime Minister on more than one occasion and is the last to do so. So, Harold Wilson is most fondly remembered for social and educational reform during a transformative period for Britain. It finally had exited the post-war period and was looking to modernize its economy and its reputation in the world. But Harold Wilson did make one big mistake. So, in 1967, faced with economic challenges such as trade deficit and a weakening currency, Wilson's government decided to devalue the pound. So, for those who don't know, devaluation involves reducing the value of a country's currency in relation to other countries, making exports more competitive but also leading to higher import prices. And this move was seen by some as a sign of economic weakness and had political repercussions. While devaluation did bring short-term benefits to the British economy, it was perceived as an admission of economic difficulties. Wilson's opponents criticised him for initially denying that devaluation would happen, and the decision may have contributed to a sense of economic decline during his leadership. So while Wilson did enjoy notable achievements, including social and educational reform, it's clear that this was a big mistake on his behalf, and it further emphasised that Britain was a shrinking economy and its influence was waning in the world, and Wilson proved to not be the great modernizer in terms of economic reform that he had hoped to be. Next up, we have Edward Heath, who is widely known as Ted Heath, so that's what we're going to call him, who served as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1970 to 1974. And one of his most significant challenges during his premiership was the issue of industrial relations and trade union conflicts, which mostly escalated during the early 1970s. One of the key moments associated with Heath's tenure was the miners' strike of 1972, which occurred in response to the government's attempt to limit miners' wage increases and the power of trade unions, a common theme with Tory prime ministers, and Labour as well during this time. The strike resulted in power cuts and a 3-day work week, and it significantly damaged Heath's government. However, perhaps Heath's most significant mistake was the decision to call a snap election in February 1974 in an attempt to gain a mandate to confront the economic and industrial challenges facing the country. The election did not produce a clear majority for either the Conservative or Labour parties, and this resulted in a hung parliament. Heath's inabilities to secure a clear mandate and the subsequent failure to form a coalition government ultimately led to his resignation as Prime Minister, which led to him sitting on the back benches of Parliament for the next 30 years or so, just looking like he's constantly sulking, and who can blame him, because this was a silly, unavoidable mistake, Ted Heath. Next, we have James Callaghan, who was the Labour Prime Minister between 1976 and 1979. He became the Prime Minister after the resignation of Harold Wilson due to poor health. And James Callaghan is most infamously remembered for the Winter of Discontent in 1978 and 1979. This was a period of widespread strikes and industrial unrest that occurred during the winter of 78 and 79. Various public sector unions, including those representing workers in hospitals, schools and public services, engaged in strikes and other forms of industrial action. The strikes led to significant disruptions, with public services being severely affected. And critics and historians rightfully argue that Callaghan's government handling of the situation was inadequate, and some attribute the perceived weakness to his decision not to call a general election during that time. After all, he was an unelected Prime Minister
succeeding Harold Wilson. Despite the challenges, Callaghan opted to carry on with the existing parliament, which ultimately led to a vote of no confidence in his government in 1979. And again, he's a Labour Prime Minister, and for a Labour Prime Minister to have a winter of discontent involving striking workers, this is surely the ultimate shame for a Labour Prime Minister. So yeah, it led to Margaret Thatcher achieving a decisive landslide victory, and yeah, Callaghan, that's where you belong, my friend. You're forgotten about, rightfully so. Okay. Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom between 1979 and 1990. Undoubtedly, in my opinion, she is the most polarizing Prime Minister of all, even more so than Winston Churchill, because at least Winston Churchill has the unifying factor that he won the Second World War. Margaret Thatcher seems to be the most divisive Prime Minister because there is a North and South divide in England over her premiership. Many Northerners hate her, many Southerners like her, at least, but even some Southerners don't like her, and there are some Northerners who do, but I digress, okay? So, yes, there's a North and South divide. Welsh and Scottish people especially hate her, so it's kind of interesting to see someone so divisive, but she is arguably one of the most important and indeed the most transformative. She transformed the economy from a deeply declining, weakened economy into one of the most powerful in the world again. She did that. She revolutionized, she modernized, and regardless of what we think about it, we can't deny her role in British history. But there is a large number of things which could be classed as a mistake here. And I mean large. More than anyone, she is, again, the most polarizing Prime Minister. She supported the retention of capital punishment, for example.
Do such terrible things to children. I think they've forfeited their own right to life.
And she mentioned so in 1985 during an interview with Channel 4. She destroyed Britain's manufacturing industry and her policies led to mass unemployment. We all know about the miners' strikes and Arthur Scargill and all this stuff. She was responsible for much of that. She presided over interest rates of 15%. She abolished free milk for school children. We've all heard of Maggie Thatcher, Milk Snatcher. We've heard of all that before. She precipitated a social housing crisis still being felt today. If you're wondering why houses are so expensive and you can't get on the housing market, well, Margaret Thatcher's policies are one of the main reasons. But most of all, her reign, and it pretty much is a reign because she was like a queen during this time. She ruled with an iron fist. She's nicknamed the Iron Lady for a reason. She is most known for her mistake of the poll tax, a controversial policy associated with her government, and it was introduced in 1989 towards the end of her premiership, and it's one of the reasons why her premiership ended. Even Tories were against the poll tax at the time. And the poll tax was met with widespread opposition and protests. Critics argued that it was regressive and disproportionately burdened lower income individuals. The fixed nature of the tax meant that poorer households had to pay a larger proportion of their income compared to wealthier households. And the opposition to the poll tax culminated in the infamous poll tax riots in March 1990. Large-scale protests took place in London and other cities, leading to clashes with the police. The unrest and the public discontent were significant factors in the decision to abandon the poll tax altogether. And in response to the widespread opposition and social unrest, Margaret Thatcher resigned as Prime Minister in November 1990, and her successor, John Major, later replaced the poll tax with the council tax in 1993. So it's the thing that destroyed her. If the poll tax didn't happen, she would have been Prime Minister for a little bit longer, I believe, although I do think it was going to happen at some point. You know, she was going to have to stand down at some point. She'd been Prime Minister for 11 years, which is very rare. And yeah, she's hated to this day by much of the working people of Britain for her poll tax, and there were celebrations when she died. She's polarizing, and this would be her biggest mistake, although there are many others we could have chosen. Next, we have John Major. John Major holds the distinction of being the Prime Minister on the day I was born, so you would think I would like him. Well, he made some big mistakes. Now, it has to be said that he has one very notable achievement, and that is the 1992 general election victory, which he was widely expected to lose. But Conservatives somehow pulled off a shocking upset victory, and you would think that this would lead to a period of greatness for John Major. Well, sadly, no. He is largely regarded as a failed Prime Minister, and some of the mistakes which he made are noteworthy. However, the biggest one of all has to be the exits from the exchange rate mechanism in 1992. So the exchange rate mechanism, or the ERM, was a system designed to stabilize exchange rates between different European currencies. And in 1992, in September, the British pound came under intense pressure, and the government was forced to withdraw the pound from the ERM on what became known as Black Wednesday, which took place on September the 16th, 1992. 1992. This move resulted in a sharp devaluation of the pound, much like poor Harold Wilson who came before. And the decision to enter the ERM and the subsequent withdrawal had significant economic repercussions. While some argue that leaving the ERM ultimately allowed for greater flexibility in monetary policy and contributed to the UK's economic recovery in the late 1990s, others criticised the government's misjudgment and the economic turbulence that followed. And again, the Conservatives are seen as the party of the economy, so economic failure hits them particularly harder. It would be like the Labour prime ministers of the 70s who had to deal with the winters of discontent, for example. And in addition to economic challenges, Major's government faced internal divisions within the Conservative Party, especially after the ERM Black Wednesday disaster. It became a very fractured party, and there was constant sleaze within it, which the leader of the opposition, Tony Blair, rightfully seized upon. And it struggled with issues such as public trust, political scandal, and challenges from the opposition Labour Party, which was sort of intruding onto Conservative territory during this time and becoming something of a centrist party itself. So it's important to note that assessing a political leader's biggest mistake is subjective, but this is John Major's biggest mistake, and it ultimately cost him when he lost in 1997 to our next man. Tony Blair. Tony Blair was the Prime Minister of my early childhood, and there was lots to be positive about at the time. He had ushered in a new wave of cool Britannia. He was modernizing, he was young, he was friends with the United States, and it felt like the United Kingdom was finally back at the center stage of geopolitical discourse. But that's kind of what his biggest mistake was, because Tony Blair's undoubted biggest mistake, and it's the one he is most criticized for, is the one which ultimately led to his premature resignation alongside a fractious relationship with his good friend Gordon Brown. But I digress. One of the most controversial and widely criticized decisions associated with Tony Blair, who served as the PM between 1997 and 2007, was the involvement in the Iraq War in 2003. So, as most of us will probably know already, Blair, alongside then US President George W. Bush, committed British troops to the military intervention in Iraq, which was based on the belief that Iraq's leader, Saddam Hussein, possessed weapons of mass destruction. The decision to go to war was met with significant domestic and international opposition. The stated rationale for military action, the weapons of mass destruction, proved to be unfounded, as no such weapons were discovered in Iraq after the invasion. The conflict resulted in significant loss of life, both among military personnel and Iraqi civilians, and it had long-lasting destabilizing effects on the region, still felt to this day. The Iraq War became a highly contentious issue, and Blair faced criticism for the intelligence failures regarding the WMDs, the lack of a clear post-war strategy, and accusations of misleading the public and Parliament itself. So the decision to go to war and its aftermath had a profound impact on Blair's legacy and on public trust in political leadership. And even today, people are still calling for Tony Blair to be tried for war crimes in The Hague. People say the same about George W. Bush too, and these two were clearly both very friendly. They both wanted to invade Iraq, and regardless of where you stand on the Iraq War, and it's a polarizing issue, it's clear that this was Tony Blair's biggest mistake, and it undid much of the good that he did. And as mentioned in part 1, I said we would cover just the 20th century prime ministers, including Gordon Brown, who though wasn't elected as prime minister in the 1990s or in the 20th century at all, he was still sort of a product of the 20th century. He was sort of co-prime minister with Tony Blair anyway, so we're going to include Gordon Brown. And Gordon Brown's biggest mistake was not calling a snap general election after ascending to Downing Street in 2007. I mean, if he called a snap general election, Labour probably would have won. They were ahead in the polls at the time. Gordon Brown was very popular because he was Chancellor for 10 years and he was seen as very competent, very intelligent. And yeah, he undid that entire reputation in just 3 years with a bunch of political scandal, a bunch of gaffes, including the one where he referred to a woman as bigoted when he thought the microphone was turned off.
What did she say?
Oh, everything. She's just a sort of bigoted woman.
Yeah, like David Cameron said, he kind of ran away from a sure victory. So this has to be Gordon Brown's biggest mistake as Prime Minister. People might say it was his handling of the economy at the time, but you can't blame the global financial crash on the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who was really not responsible for it. So yeah, I'm going to go with not calling a general election as his biggest mistake. And that concludes the single biggest mistake of every 20th century Prime Minister plus Gordon Brown. And yeah, current prime ministers, again, there have been many in recent years, have all made significant mistakes too. We could include David Cameron's austerity. We can include Theresa May existing. We can include Boris Johnson, Partygate. We can make a number of criticisms against them already, but we're not going to do that. I mean, I kind of just did, but you know, I'm not going to do that here because this is not the place for a political debate, and you don't even know my political views, man, so don't judge me. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please hit the subscribe button. Don't forget you can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Collective Histories page, and on Instagram at instagram.com/The Collective Histories, and Twitter or X gonna give it to you at twitter.com/Collective Histo, and you can always buy me a coffee. I'm very thirsty after recording this, and that's buymeacoffee.com/Collective Histories, and then after that you should definitely watch another one of our videos. I'd be very grateful, and I would say thank you and shake your hand much like everyone else on this list did, and I'll probably call you a bigoted woman at some point, but I promise I won't because it's not going to get caught because I don't leave the mic on afterwards. Okay, anyway, have a lovely day, have a lovely weekend, and I'll be back on Monday for the next video. Will it be another series? We'll find out then. Okay, goodbye!